Welcome back to Eye on the Issues. Today, we're talking with Steve Klein about a number of topics, including campaign finance. Steve, welcome to the show. And why don't you give us a little bit of your background?
Thanks, Mike. So my time in Wyoming, 2010 to 2015, was all too long ago, but I still make it back. Now I practice free speech, First Amendment law nationwide, everywhere. Cases out of Oregon, Pennsylvania, here in the District of Columbia, Texas. So really all over the place, and two pending in Wyoming right now. I also continue to lobby on behalf of the Wyoming Liberty Group on campaign finance, sometimes other free speech issues. So Wyoming is the one place I will come, and if the law is unconstitutional, I'll give the legislature a chance to change it before we file a lawsuit. That's just what a nice guy I am.
Let's begin by talking about campaign finance issues there. What is happening in the state?
Well, this is now a 10-year saga, it seems, and I hate to say that I hate to say it's been going on for so long, but it seems the post-Citizens United case from the United States Supreme Court that said the very controversial thing that you couldn't ban movies about presidential candidates has been run through a blender and makes people act like that the oligarchs can buy elections or buy politicians with free reign. That's not the truth at all, but here we are. Wyoming law is often portrayed as being behind other states. I thought it was pretty darn good already in 2010, pretty simple, easy to understand, easy to follow. Basically, what campaign finance law should be to me is simple enough that you don't need an attorney or an accountant just to run for office, right? The whole idea of grassroots advocacy kind of dies on the vine when you try and put complex rules and regulations on political activity. So that's been the fight for a long time, and there's been some major setbacks over the last few years. Now, if you miss a certain filing deadline, if you have a candidate or campaign misses a deadline, the fines can be up to $500 per day until you file it, which is really pretty dastardly in a state where you can run a pretty effective campaign, especially for the House or local election, for maybe $3,000, probably less. And then you've got the reports themselves. If you file them, they're filed under penalty of perjury. So if you get something wrong and you get the wrong prosecutor with an itch, suddenly you're subject to felony criminal charges. So it's really, I don't question the well-meaningness here. And yet the proof is in the pudding that a lot of legislators, they kind of get this opinion, well, I had to follow the rules, never realizing that for a lot of people, tripping up, there should be a little more flexibility, and they really shouldn't be the rules shouldn't be this onerous in the first place.
And how did we get here, since things were simple, 13 years ago, or more simple?
It's always, the rhetoric and the irony, again, I don't mind people speaking, and I'm very much a minority in campaign finance. There's got to be a dozen of us, and I've been blessed at Y Liberty for years, worked with Benjamin Barr. He's now my law partner. We still do these cases together, and it's a small minority of people who have the privilege of representing the people actually being crushed by these laws. And in Wyoming, there's no better example than the Wyoming gun owners. And this was the cliche campaign finance complaint played out. WYGO took out an ad on Facebook criticizing a House candidate during the primary. And instead of putting out counter speech, putting out her own advertisement, or other supporters of her putting out their own counter speech, they went ahead and filed a campaign finance complaint. And they made sure that a newspaper had a copy of the complaint even before the Secretary of State saw it, right? So it ends up on the front page of a newspaper before the government even acts. So there's a brilliance to that, that kind of bushwhacking. What happened was WYGO, back then, the fine wasn't $500 per day. It was a flat $500 fee. So WYGO paid the fee or the fine. And then we went to federal court and said, look, the ad that they took out is not subject to campaign finance law. And we had that law struck down. Federal court in Casper, Judge Skavdal struck that down, unconstitutionally vague. And that case is now on appeal in the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals. My co-counsel from the Institute for Free Speech argued that in January, I think, it was earlier this year. So we're still waiting on an opinion there. But, instead of addressing that, that law is completely unenforceable. I think it's going to stay that way because the 10th Circuit is pretty good on campaign finance issues. Instead of addressing that, the committee is just in the interim right now before next year's legislative session, trying to add more red tape that is probably unconstitutional.
And one of the cases you mentioned that you're in the midst of, I guess, is Frank versus Gray, Chuck Gray being the Secretary of State. What's the status on that?
Yeah, Frank v. Gray is another one pending at the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals, another one that we won in Wyoming federal trial court, and that was in front of Judge Nancy Friedenthal in Cheyenne. And that one is, I'll tell you, Mike, that was a labor of love for me. This case, another one, goes back a long time. I remember in 2014, you want to talk about political engagement, a man by the name of Don Wills ran for, he made it onto the ballot as an independent candidate for governor. And that cost him a pretty penny. He had to go gather the signatures necessary to actually get on the ballot. And his signature gatherers were fantastic. They were doing great work. But 45 days before a primary election, signature gathering around absentee polling places is banned. It's considered electioneering, even though gathering a signature has nothing to do with what people are voting on in that given election. You're trying to get someone on the ballot for the next election. And so that's 2014. And I'm hearing about signature gatherers being threatened with misdemeanor charges here in Cheyenne for being around the courthouse. And it really stuck in my craw. And that was one that I'm so appreciative to Y Liberty for helping us get that lawsuit off the ground. And of course, our clients, John C. Frank, and a signature gathering company, Grassfire, for stepping up. So that was a bigger challenge than I thought it would be. The 10th Circuit has never addressed polling place buffer zones, and they're taking their time about it. So we won in district court. We struck down the election day zone, which was a gigantic football field size radius, basically not just preventing signature gathering, but any form of electioneering. That's such a big zone that if you have a house too close to, say, the polling place at the Cary Gym, you can't even have a yard sign on election day in front of your house. I mean,
it's crazy.
So yeah, I think that one, was I guess the easy part of the lawsuit. But as far as these absentee polling places like the courthouse, where so much else is going on during early voting besides voting,
Right.
the 10th Circuit's really taken their time about it. I've never waited this long after oral argument on an appellate opinion. It was May of last year that we argued the case, and I tell you, I know again it's this interview certainly won't change, won't speed them up. They're going to rule in their own good time, but that's pretty tough. Waiting about 15 months now and counting to get a ruling. So
overall, from a free speech standpoint, what else is going on in Wyoming that you think would be of interest to the residents there?
Not much else coming to mind right now. I really, our focus on campaign finance law in particular, again, like I say, is because nobody else is doing it. And so many other states are worse. I think we've kept it from getting, I don't like to brag about, well, it could be worse. And if we hadn't been there, it might be. But when at the committee right now, you've had testimony from a county clerk who's really upset that some people got together and took out an ad in a newspaper during the last election and didn't fill out the forms on wycampaignfinance.gov. And I encourage everybody to go visit that website because it's very hard to use and it doesn't really provide much in the way of information, but that's where you have to file the reports. And that's where citizens are allegedly going to go look up all this money in politics. It's that perspective of, wow, you're engaging in politics without filling out the forms instead of celebrating free speech, that people, wow, that's great that people got together. And there have been a lot of incidents like that in recent years. Newspaper ad in Rock Springs got smacked around by a prosecutor out there. A recent investigation in Sheridan going after a mailer that didn't even identify someone who was up for election. It was kind of a I'll admit, kind of shady poison pen letter about some locals, and they didn't charge them with anything because there was nothing to charge them with, but they used the police power to investigate all the people behind it before deciding what they should have known at the outset. We don't have anything to investigate. So I think that's, that's always we're really in a troublesome situation nationwide. I don't think I've ever seen the level of which, discrimination in other states, viewpoint discrimination at school board meetings. That's a huge one. And it's really, I mean, coast to coast. Fortunately, I haven't heard much of that happening in Wyoming. There are talks, the more nuanced talks about what kind of books should be in the library for children. I do think that's actually a pretty worthwhile conversation to have. I don't think that's as big a free speech issue. Get me into high school and start talking Catcher in the Rye. I'll get a little more inspired as opposed to what they're trying to put in front of third graders, certain people.
Sure. So let me ask you this. How do you think from a school board and free speech and whatnot, books in libraries and schools, how do we get to this point where we are from a national standpoint? 10 years ago, this discussion wasn't even happening.
Well, and the good news is I take a lot of heart in history, and Wyoming, like so many other states. And my example for this is campaign finance. Campaign finance law is more than a century old now. Wyoming passed, like a number of states, its first campaign finance law in 1912 during the Progressive era. And I mean, you couldn't really make this up that John Kendrick, who was then in the Wyoming Senate, he voted in favor of it. He was then became governor, and he's running for United States Senate in the first popular election of senators in 1916. And what does the Republican Party do? They accuse him of violating the Corrupt Practices Act. And they took out newspaper ads all over the state. Every Republican newspaper had these big old ads. And it was plainly obvious, even in some of the ads, that he had not even violated the law. But they called it corruption. That's what they did. Now, Kendrick went on to win that election, and I'm glad he did, even though he's a Democrat. Ha ha. But I think, again, in 1938, judge by the name of Fred Bloom on the Wyoming Supreme Court, longest serving judge ever, 4 decades or so on the court there. His opponent, sued the Secretary of State, claiming campaign finance violations and with no basis in the law, trying to get Bloom thrown off the ballot, right? So in a sense, everything old is new again. I take heart in that. I don't like where we're at with free speech right now culturally. I certainly don't like where we're at legally. But in a sense, it's a miracle we have the First Amendment. And we should be so grateful for that. And I mean, look, even some of the founding fathers, John Adams included, what does he do when he becomes president? After signing our own Constitution, right? He passes the Sedition Act. I mean, one of the worst, affronts to free speech in this nation's history, where they were actually imprisoning people for saying the wrong things about the president. So in a sense, it may be in writing, but it is the vigilance. It's that eternal vigilance of the citizenry. And I'm lucky I get to be on the front line in the courtrooms. I'm lucky that I have receptive judges who believe, the power of the third branch should be used to enforce our constitutional rights. But culturally, I think, it's on every citizen, Wyoming and beyond. Just, don't get, by all means be offended, but don't try to shut people down, especially don't use the law to do it.
But in respect to Wyoming and free speech and everything you've spoken about, I greatly appreciate it. Is there anything about Wyoming that you'd like to cover that we haven't discussed?
Oh, Mike, I'm looking forward to talking again in the future. Over the years, criminal justice reform, property issues, there's all sorts of good stuff going on. And I hope to at least have a little bit of involvement in it. But, having been away for 8 years, I think I acknowledge my prowess now is more in the courtroom than as a lobbyist. But nevertheless, it's wonderful to show up and engage in that way before going to the courtroom.
Yep. Let me finish by asking this one question. Obviously, you don't live there now, but what do you like most? When you lived there, what did you like most about living in Wyoming?
Oh my goodness. I still like it now. The historic archives, I mean, that's my hobby now. I've given you all a little history lesson on this one, but I have to say that the Wyoming State Archives, the American Heritage Center at the University of Wyoming, just even talking with people in local museums for some of my historic research, it's an absolute delight. And I mean, it's that rich history, whether it's cowboy stuff or political history. There's so many untold stories, and they're just waiting to be dug up and dusted off. So
nice. All right, Steve, thank you so much for your time. Appreciate it.
Thanks a lot, Mike.
To find out more about what's going on around Wyoming, go to wyliberty.org. That's wyliberty.org.